My name is Wolfgang Weissenstein. I'm 69 years old. I'm married, second time around. My wife and I, we've got 5 children between us. I've been 55 years in the garment industry on a technical basis. I learned to sew. Listen, it's never going to make me wealthy, but it's fun. The definition of a true gentleman, I really don't have a specific definition. I could give you a long, filled with words description, and it would all be very flamboyant. But I think I would have to quote the Dalai Lama, and I would say, pure thoughts, pure actions. Because my father was an all-round gentleman. I mean, he opened the doors. I mean, he worshipped my mother. He always looked like a gentleman. He loved it. He was always well turned out. I learned from him to stay relevant. He liked to keep up to date and to participate. He was able to be a gentleman at the same time as being a father and a grandfather. He was the epitome for me. There's such a big gap in my knowledge about my father. I know more about my father from my mother than I know from my father. I've got so many questions for him, things that I didn't ask him when I was young, when I could have. When I spent time driving across the countryside with him, he had a very loving, slightly mischievous expression with a glint in his eye. That would be the most apparent thing to me that I remember that, makes me feel warm. He was a trained interior decorator and upholsterer. I mean, a fond memory of my father is that he'd have the lounge suite for 3 or 4 weeks on the veranda of our house. We lived on a farm in what was then called Rhodesia, Zimbabwe today. And he'd have we didn't have anywhere to sit because he had the lounge suite upside down, taking it to pieces. He had all the tools, the needles and the thread and the springs. So I loved watching my father doing this kind of work. Besides having the lounge suite on the veranda upside down, we couldn't use the car because he had the car on wooden blocks and in the engine out. And he would take 2 days to take the engine out and put it back together, and I would sit in the car. So he was very good at things like that. He was very hardworking and highly skilled. I don't really know what the circumstances were, but my father told me to get into the car, and we raced through a couple of gates to a particular mealie field, and we encountered poachers. And they had their weapons on the truck. And my father, without arms, confronted them and confiscated all their weapons and then let them go. I mean, I was shitting myself. I would have turned around and said, look, let's just leave this alone. I mean, I was a little kid. I was 10 years old, possibly. But that was quite important for me to experience that. And there was a bit of a party. And my father got a little bit tipsy. He drank gin, which wasn't, my father was not a drinker or anything like it. He liked to smoke cigarettes, but he didn't, I never saw him inebriated in any way. But this particular evening, I was scared because I knew that my father was different. Because he had maybe 3 or 4 or 2 or 3 or whatever it was, gins. And everybody's different when they have a couple of drinks. And it made me frightened, it made me insecure. And later on that night, the lights were off, we were in bed, and I could hear my father come down the passage. He opened the door and I can see his dark silhouette in the door. And he said, "Gute Nacht, Wolfgang." And I just ignored him. I didn't say, "Good night, Dad, sleep well," or I just ignored him. And I really, I've regretted that since that moment. It was wrong of me. Because he hadn't done anything wrong. And I didn't respond. So I regret that. Then that's something I can't rectify. The most memorable thing for me is the day that he died. I was working in the same town where my parents lived. And that morning we shared a garage where we had a petrol account in this particular service station. And my father had just been given a BMW, a second-hand BMW from my brother. And I pulled up at the pump, with the pump on my right-hand side. And there my father drove up on the other side of the petrol pumps, beautifully turned out. And he looked over the car and he looked at me and he said, "Good morning, Mr. Weissenstein." And I said, "Good morning, Mr. Weissenstein." And we had a little chat. But it registered in my mind that this was unusual. My father never referred to me as Mr. Weissenstein. I'm Wolfgang. But he called me Mr. Weissenstein. Later on that afternoon, about 5 o'clock in the afternoon, I get a phone call to say that my father had an accident and I must come home immediately. So he went for a walk that evening. He had his Ronson lighter in his pocket. And when he was knocked down, and there the Ronson has got the dent, obviously with the impact of the motor car where it knocked him. So this means a lot to me, this lighter. Anyway, I took my mother to the hospital and we sat in the casualty ward, as you do on those benches. And behind the curtains, we could hear, it was a hive of activity, all these people attending to him. We didn't see him, we just heard him groaning. And an hour and a half later, they came to us and said, we're taking him upstairs for x-rays. And we followed them upstairs, and outside the x-ray theater on the first floor of the hospital, the general hospital, my father was lying on the gurney, groaning. And I went up to him, on his left-hand side, he was lying like this, and I'm stood here. And I touched him, and I kissed him. And when I touched him, he was able to move his right hand. I touched his left hand, and I can feel him squeezing my hand like this. And that was it. They wheeled him away into the x-ray theater, and within minutes, we could see the faces of the doctors when they came out, and they came to tell my mother and I that there was nothing that they could do. Depending on the kind of life, the fabric and the color of your life that you've lived, I think there's a beginning, there's a middle, and you also know when the end comes. And if you have lived the kind of life that you set out to live, you'll be happy when the end comes. I think my father would have been of that opinion.